Hello, my sleepy heads. It's good to have you back on History for Sleep. In the following minutes, you will experience a deep state of relaxation. This story helps you to easily sleep through the night, so you can get up energized in the morning. Not only will you fall asleep faster, you will also get rid of disturbing thoughts. Listen to these history stories for at least 10 days for the best results. The longer you listen to the video, the more likely you'll experience persistent and positive changes in the way you sleep. I wish you a great rest, and if you haven't already, we'd be very happy if you consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss any new calming and relaxing history story. Tonight, we're going to slowly wander back into the world of Tudor Britain, a land of kings and commoners, of shadowed streets and timbered homes. Tudor England, a place of bustling markets and quiet chapels, where life could be harsh and uncertain, yet filled with small rituals that gave shape to each passing day. Over the next couple of hours, we'll explore 5 things you would surely face if you found yourself living in this world long ago. The food that sustained you, the labor that weighed upon you, the faith that guided you, the dangers that threatened you, and the fleeting joys that brightened your path. But before you get comfortable and let your mind drift into this history of Tudor Britain, I'd love it if you could take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if these calm stories of the past bring you peace. Your support truly helps me grow and keep making these calm journey through time just for you. And in the comments, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always so wonderful to see our little community listening together from all corners of the world, quietly sharing these stories across space and time. So, settle in, take a slow breath, and let us step softly into the land of the Nile, where each sunrise and sunset tells a story of life, survival, and human resilience. Now let's begin. The day in Tudor England began not with the pleasant hum of alarms or the comfort of warm duvets, but with the gray wash of dawn seeping through small, uneven windows. A Tudor cottage or town home was a world of shadows and creaks, its wooden beams groaning as though the house itself had been awake all night. The fire from the hearth, if it had not been tended carefully, would have long since died, leaving the room cold and damp. You might wake on a straw mattress, its stuffing lumpy and alive with small creatures, beneath rough wool blankets that itched against your skin. The air smelled faintly of smoke, of animals kept nearby, and of people living close together. Morning did not arrive with choice or leisure. It arrived with the needs of survival, pulling you from sleep because the chores of the day were already waiting. In Tudor homes, whether a peasant's cottage or the chamber of a manor, awakening was rarely gentle, but it was the start of yet another day to endure, shaped by duty, hunger, and faith. For most ordinary Tudors, rising at first light was a necessity, not a preference. Candles and lanterns were too costly to burn freely, and so the household lived by the rhythm of the sun. As soon as the first light slipped in, families stirred. Children were often the first to wake, sometimes pressed into small chores even before eating. In rural homes, this might mean tending to animals, letting chickens out, checking on pigs, or fetching water from a nearby stream or well. Water, drawn heavy and cold, was needed for everything: cooking, cleaning, even the most basic washing. In towns, the sounds of the streets outside became the alarm. Vendors stirring, animals braying, and neighbors beginning their own restless shuffle into the day. To linger in bed was a privilege few could afford, unless you were wealthy or noble. For everyone else, the morning demanded you rise quickly, shake the straw from your hair, and begin. The bed itself, if one could call it that, was not the cushioned comfort we know today. For peasants, it might be nothing more than a wooden frame with ropes stretched across it, over which a sack of straw or reeds had been placed. The ropes would sag over time, and the mattress would grow lumpy and foul, in need of constant restuffing. Blankets, often made of coarse wool, kept the cold at bay, but not always well enough during harsh winters. In the wealthier households, feather beds and linen sheets offered more comfort, but even there, the air of the room was heavy and cold in the mornings, the stones or timbers sweating with damp. The wealthy might also wake to servants arriving quietly, pulling curtains open or tending to the fire. But for the vast majority of Tudors, the warmth of the hearth had to be coaxed back into life by their own hands. The morning chill was a constant, a silent reminder of how fragile comfort was in a world ruled by the elements. What you woke to depended much on where you lived. In the countryside, the morning was punctuated by the cries of roosters, the bleating of sheep, and the rustle of fields stretching beyond the small, smoky home. In towns, it was the clatter of carts, the barking of dogs, the call of hawkers preparing for market day. In both settings, the smell of wood smoke lingered, mingling with the earthy scent of mud floors, rushes strewn to keep dampness at bay, and the unavoidable presence of waste, human and animal alike. Noise carried differently, too. Thick wooden beams and thatch muffled sound in cottages, while timbered townhouses echoed with the life of neighbors above, below, or beside you. Privacy was a rare luxury. Families often slept in the same room, sometimes in the same bed, bodies pressed close for warmth. Morning meant not just waking yourself, but rousing those around you, each stirring setting off a chain of yawns, groans, and the rustle of sleep falling away. Clothing was often put on quickly, and rarely was it fresh. Most people slept in little more than their day garments or simple shifts, rising to pull on the same rough woolen clothes they had worn the day before. Laundering was laborious and infrequent, meaning garments held the smells of smoke, sweat, and work. Shoes were heavy and worn, and stockings were patched repeatedly. For those with means, clean linen might await them, freshly laundered by servants, crisp against the skin. But for peasants and townsfolk, cleanliness was secondary to warmth and durability. To wake in Tudor England was to step immediately into the garments of labor, clothing that did not change with fashion or day, but instead carried you through tasks until they fell to pieces. This was the reality for most: practicality over comfort, survival over choice. Dressing was less an act of preparation and more a continuation of life's endurance. The first meal of the day, if one could call it breakfast, was not a matter of indulgence, but of necessity. Upon rising, many Tudors would begin with nothing at all, saving food for later. Bread, coarse and heavy, paired with a weak ale, might serve as a morning bite, though children and laborers often began their day on empty stomachs. Food was not waiting neatly upon a table. It had to be fetched, prepared, or rationed from what was left. Waking meant considering hunger immediately, not just for yourself, but for the entire household. What little food was available had to be stretched across many mouths, and so the morning was often marked by the scraping of pots, the careful slicing of loaves, and the quiet hope that there was enough to last until night. Even before the sun had fully risen, the awareness of scarcity was awake within every Tudor home. For the wealthy, awakening was a different ritual entirely. In grander houses, nobles might rise to the sound of servants bustling quietly, lighting fires, and bringing in warm water for washing. Bed hangings and heavy curtains kept out drafts, while feather mattresses and fine linens offered a luxury unimaginable to the poor. Breakfast might include meat, cheese, or sweet spiced bread, with wine or strong ale to accompany it. Where a peasant's morning was marked by labor and scarcity, a noble's morning was defined by ritual and comfort. Yet even here, the shadow of Tudor uncertainty remained. Illness, political intrigue, or sudden misfortune could strike anyone, regardless of wealth. Still, to wake as a noble in Tudor England was to rise into a world of relative ease, the weight of survival cushioned by privilege. Awakening in Tudor England, then, was not just the act of opening one's eyes. It was the first negotiation of the day, a reckoning with cold, hunger, duty, and the simple persistence of life. To wake meant to remember your place, whether in a smoky cottage, pressed against family members on a straw bed, or in a great chamber with tapestries and servants. The day loomed ahead, filled with labor, uncertainty, and faith. The morning hours carried the promise of daylight, but also the burden of survival. For the modern listener, awakening in a Tudor home reminds us how distant and yet how close those lives were. Lives where every morning was both a challenge and a quiet triumph. To rise each day in Tudor England was to continue, to endure, and to step once more into a world that demanded everything from those who lived within it. Hunger was a constant companion in Tudor England, one that walked beside rich and poor alike, though it gnawed more sharply at those with little. To sit at a Tudor table was to be reminded of your place in the world. What was set before you spoke of status as much as sustenance. For peasants, the day began with coarse bread, made from rye or barley, heavy in the stomach and rough on the teeth. Sometimes a weak ale accompanied it, brewed thin and safe to drink, unlike the water that often carried sickness. This meager fare filled the belly just enough to push through the long hours of labor ahead. For the wealthy, tables might groan with roasted meats, spiced pies, and sweet fruits brought from abroad, though even their abundance came with its own dangers: overindulgence, illness, and the fear of running afoul of strict fasting laws imposed by the church. Hunger, in Tudor England, was never far away, whether in the emptiness of a peasant's stomach or the uneasy fullness of a noble's feast. Bread, ale, and pottage formed the backbone of the common diet, meals that changed little from day to day. Pottage was a thick stew, boiled slowly in iron pots over open hearths, filled with whatever ingredients could be gathered: grains, beans, leeks, or sometimes a scrap of bacon if fortune allowed. It was humble food, yet it kept bodies alive. Hunger meant not the absence of meals, but the monotony of them, the endless repetition of the same heavy, filling staples. For those who worked the land, food was both fuel and burden. Too little left them weak, while too much of the same left them longing for variety they would never taste. The Tudor table was a reminder that survival was measured not in pleasure, but in endurance. Each bite was a small victory against the pull of hunger. In towns, food came with different challenges. Markets overflowed with sounds and smells. Fishmongers selling eels and herring, bakers offering loaves, butchers hanging their cuts of meat. Yet not everyone could buy what they saw. Prices fluctuated with harvests, and poor families often went without. A bad season could push entire households to the edge of famine. Bread riots were not uncommon, sparked by the frustration of those who could no longer afford their daily loaf. For the poorest, scraps were gathered from what wealthier families discarded, or meals were stretched by mixing in weeds and herbs from the hedgerows. Hunger was not just physical, but social, a marker of where you stood. To enter a Tudor market was to witness both abundance and deprivation, side by side, each reinforcing the other. The wealthy, meanwhile, sat at tables layered with ceremony. Meals were occasions, marked by rituals of serving, of hierarchy, of display. Roasted swan, venison, and game birds appeared alongside spiced wine and imported sugar. To be served such dishes was to announce one's place in the Tudor order. Yet even here, hunger lingered, though less for food itself and more for the power it represented. A noble table was not just nourishment, it was theater. Every dish, every goblet, every carving knife spoke of wealth and influence. To be denied such meals was to fall from favor, to lose standing. Thus, hunger among the rich was less a gnawing of the stomach and more a fear of slipping from the delicate dance of status and privilege. Religious fasting added another layer to Tudor hunger. The church dictated when and how people ate, with Fridays and Lent requiring abstinence from meat. Fish took the place of flesh, leading to an enormous trade in salted herring and dried cod, which were shipped across the country to meet the demand. For peasants, this often meant enduring even less variety than usual, the monotony of salted fish becoming its own burden. Yet to break these rules was to risk both sin and punishment, so families complied. Hunger, then, was not only a matter of scarcity but also of obedience. The rhythms of eating were shaped not by appetite but by faith, each fast a reminder that food was tied not only to survival but to salvation. Children felt hunger sharply. In peasant households, Young ones often ate last, after parents had taken what they needed to work the fields. A child's bowl might be thin pottage or a scrap of bread softened in ale, hardly enough to fill their growing bodies. Many went to bed with their stomachs rumbling, dreams haunted by visions of fuller tables they would never see. In wealthier families, children were more likely to taste sweetness, sugared almonds, honeyed cakes. But even then, indulgence was tempered by fear of spoiling or gluttony. To be a child in Tudor England was to learn early the lessons of hunger, whether through scarcity or restraint, each meal a reminder of one's place in a world of inequality. Seasonality added another burden to the Tudor table. Food was bound tightly to the rhythms of harvest and preservation. Summer and autumn brought abundance, fresh fruits, grains, and vegetables, but winter pressed hard upon the poor. Preserved meats, salted fish, dried beans, and whatever root vegetables could be stored in cellars were all that remained. Meals grew monotonous, and hunger became sharper during the dark months, when stores ran low and the promise of spring felt far away. Wealthier families relied on imported goods to soften the edges of scarcity, but for the majority, winter was a test of endurance. To sit at the Tudor table in January was to reckon with the limits of nature and the fragility of survival. Thus, hunger in Tudor England was more than the absence of food. It was a constant presence, shaping lives, decisions, and dreams. It lived in the empty bowls of peasants, in the strict rules of religion, in the markets where prices rose beyond reach, and even in the gilded halls of the wealthy, where food was more spectacle than sustenance. To awaken and approach the Tudor table was to face hunger in some form, whether through scarcity, monotony, or the endless striving for more. For us today, the Tudor table is a reminder of how fragile the balance of life once was, how each meal was a small victory, and how hunger was the silent companion of an entire age. To live in Tudor England was to labor, body and soul bound to the rhythms of work. For peasants, life was measured not in hours, but in tasks. The endless cycle of sowing, weeding, harvesting, and tending animals. The sun itself was the clock, pulling them from bed at first light and guiding them until darkness pressed them back indoors. Fields stretched wide, demanding bent backs and calloused hands, and the earth gave little in return except through unrelenting toil. Men, women, and children alike bore the burden, each pair of hands a necessity to keep hunger at bay. The weight of labor was not a choice, but a truth, carved into the muscles and minds of all who lived close to the land. For women, labor did not end with the field or the market. The hearth was its own workplace, demanding constant tending. Bread needed kneading, pottage required stirring, and clothing had to be washed, mended, and spun. Water was fetched, firewood gathered, children soothed and guided into chores of their own. Work for Tudor women was not confined to one space, but stretched across every moment of waking life. Even in the wealthier households, where servants might carry much of the burden, mistresses of the house still oversaw the rhythms of domestic labor, ensuring food was prepared, linens clean, and guests properly attended. Work was everywhere, filling each breath of the day. Children, too, were caught early in the web of labor. From as young as 7 or 8, they were expected to shoulder tasks that contributed to the household's survival. Boys might scare crows from crops, carry wood, or tend livestock. Girls learned to spin, sew, and help prepare food, their small hands busy from dawn to dusk. For families who could not spare them, education was rare, replaced instead by the school of necessity. Only those of wealth could send their children to tutors or grammar schools, where Latin and scripture replaced buckets and brooms. For most, childhood was brief, labor its defining feature, and play a fleeting luxury found only in stolen moments. In towns and cities, the work was different, but no less demanding. Craftsmen rose early to hammer, forge, and stitch, their livelihoods tied to guilds and apprenticeships. Apprentices lived under strict rules, bound to their masters for years, learning skills that might one day support them. The streets rang with the noise of trade, the clang of metal workers, the chatter of merchants, the clop of hooves carrying goods to market. Bakers began before dawn, ensuring bread was ready by morning. Butchers labored over carcasses, while washerwomen bent over streams and basins, scrubbing clothes for others. The labor of townspeople filled the air as surely as smoke, binding the community in a shared rhythm of effort. The wealthy, though free from the harshest physical labor, were not free from the weight of work in other ways. Their labor was often political or social, managing estates, entertaining guests, securing alliances, and navigating the dangerous waters of Tudor courtly life. For nobles, a misstep at court could mean ruin, exile, or worse. Letters had to be written, accounts balanced, servants overseen, and appearances maintained. Leisure existed, but so too did the unending pressure to remain in favor, to keep wealth and power intact. Work for the wealthy was less about sweat and soil and more about vigilance, performance, and control. In its own way, this too was exhausting. The labor of survival written into manners and intrigue rather than fields and tools. Seasonal work defined much of Tudor life, particularly for those bound to the land. Summer brought long hours under the sun, fields full of grain to be cut and bound, hay to be stacked, and harvests to be gathered before the weather turned. Autumn demanded preservation, salting, drying, and storing enough food to endure the winter. Winter itself brought fewer outdoor tasks, but no true rest, for tools needed mending, animals feeding, and fuel gathering. Spring meant plowing and planting, long days of preparation for the cycle to begin again. The Tudor year was not divided by leisure, but by labor, each season pressing its own weight upon weary shoulders. Even moments of pause were colored by the shadow of work. Meals were brief interludes before the body was pressed back into labor. Sundays and holy days brought respite, but even then, obligations of faith often felt like another form of duty. Music, games, and festivals offered escapes, Yet they were rare and fleeting compared to the steady march of tasks that filled each day. Work was not simply a part of Tudor life. It was life itself, inseparable from survival. To stop working meant risking hunger, illness, or death, and so the wheel of labor turned without ceasing. For us, imagining the weight of Tudor labor is to glimpse a world where every movement carried purpose, where the body was both tool and burden, and where idleness was nearly impossible. To wake in Tudor England was to step immediately into work, to measure life not in dreams or ambitions, but in the tasks required to endure another day. The fields, the hearth, the workshop, the court, all demanded effort, each in its own way. To survive was to labor, and to labor was to live. In Tudor England, the weight of work pressed down upon all, a constant companion from the moment of waking to the final collapse of sleep. When you step beyond the wooden door of a Tudor home and into the town, you enter a world of sound and smell, a living theater of daily life. The streets were narrow and winding, often muddy from rain or fouled by waste thrown from upper windows. Timber-framed houses leaned toward one another, their thatched or tiled roofs nearly touching, creating shadowed passages that twisted and turned. These streets were alive, pulsing with people moving about their tasks. Dogs and chickens wandered freely, mingling with barefoot children darting through puddles. The air carried the heavy mingling scents of smoke, tanneries, open drains, and fresh bread cooling on a stall. A single street was never silent. It was a constant hum of voices, footsteps, and trade. Markets were the heart of Tudor towns, where people from countryside and city alike mingled to barter, buy, and gossip. On market days, stalls overflowed with produce from surrounding farms. Baskets of apples and pears, sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, and bundles of herbs. But markets were not just about food. Craftsmen displayed their wares, from hand-thrown pottery to iron tools, leather goods, and simple woolen garments. A cacophony rose from the throng, sellers calling out their goods, buyers haggling for fairer prices, and minstrels playing for coins. The market was not only a place to shop, but a stage where Tudor life was enacted in its fullest. Among the stalls, butchers stood out, their trade a noisy and bloody affair. Whole carcasses hung on hooks, the smell of raw meat heavy in the air. Fishmongers called attention to their wares, fresh from rivers or coasts, though the scent of fish lingered long past its freshness. Bakers, meanwhile, sold warm loaves wrapped in steam, attracting crowds with the promise of bread both common and fine. Alewives offered cups of ale from barrels set beside their stalls, a brief moment of refreshment for weary shoppers. Each craft and trade added its own sound, its own texture, until the market became a tapestry of Tudor survival. Yet the market was more than trade. It was also a meeting place, a crossroads of stories and news. Gossip spread here faster than anywhere else. Who had married? Who had fallen ill? Which noble had risen or fallen in the shifting tides of court? Rumors of war, rebellion, or plague filtered through these spaces, carried by merchants and travelers who moved between towns. For many, the market was the only source of wider knowledge, connecting the small world of a Tudor town to the larger kingdom beyond. It was here, in the press of bodies and voices, that the pulse of Tudor society could truly be felt. Children darted through the crowds, carrying baskets or simply chasing one another, while beggars crouched near the busiest lanes, holding out hands or bowls for alms. The poor, visibly marked by ragged clothing and hollow cheeks, reminded all who passed of the thin line between survival and ruin. At the same time, constables and watchmen patrolled, keeping an eye out for thieves or troublemakers. Pickpockets were common, slipping through the press of bodies, while brawls sometimes broke out when ale or anger ran too freely. The streets were alive with opportunity, but they were never free of danger. To walk in a Tudor market was to walk through a living current of humanity, unpredictable and unceasing. The soundscape of the town was as constant as its motion. Carts rumbled across uneven cobbles, their wheels clattering loudly. Horses and donkeys brayed, while hawkers shouted their wares. Church bells tolled above it all, marking hours, calling the faithful, and ringing out warnings or celebrations. At nightfall, when the market closed and traders packed their goods away, another sound rose. The laughter and shouts of those lingering in alehouses, or the occasional cry in the darkness. The Tudor town never slept entirely. Even in silence, it carried the echoes of its daily noise. Not all parts of town were equal, and the sounds and smells shifted as you wandered. Near the wealthier districts, streets were cleaner, houses larger, and stalls offered finer goods, imported spices, silks, and rare wines. Here, voices were quieter, the press of bodies less overwhelming. But in poorer quarters, streets narrowed even further, refuse piled higher, and markets offered only the simplest necessities. The contrasts were stark, and yet both rich and poor passed through the same centers of trade, each tethered to the same pulse of market life. To step through the streets and markets of Tudor England is to feel the thrum of existence itself, busy, crowded, noisy, and always demanding attention. For the weary traveler or townsman alike, it was overwhelming, an endless tide of movement and sound. And yet, it was here that survival was secured, news exchanged, and community bound together. The streets and markets were not just spaces of commerce, but the very stage upon which Tudor life played out, day after noisy day, without pause. In Tudor England, faith was not simply a private matter. It was the very rhythm of daily life, woven into every hour of the day. From the moment you awoke, the tolling of church bells reminded you of the greater order that ruled above kings and queens. The bells marked matins at dawn, the Angelus at noon, and Vespers at dusk, anchoring the community to a cycle of prayer and devotion. For the ordinary Tudor, religion was not a choice, but a structure that governed how you lived, what you ate, how you dressed, and even how you thought. The church was ever present, its spire rising above the rooftops, its shadow stretching into every home, every hearth, and every heart. To stray from faith was not simply dangerous for the soul, it was dangerous for life itself. The rituals of faith brought comfort as much as they brought obligation. Crossing oneself before meals, kneeling in prayer at the day's end, fasting during Lent, and attending weekly services, all were part of the familiar rhythm. A Tudor peasant or townsman might not understand every detail of Scripture, but they knew that prayers bound them to their community and safeguarded their place in eternity. Holy days punctuated the year, offering rest from labor and moments of celebration, yet also reminding all of the authority of God. Even the smallest gestures, lighting a candle for the departed, whispering a prayer before sowing seed, wove a sense of sacred order into an otherwise uncertain world. Yet faith in Tudor England was also bound tightly to fear. Sin lurked everywhere, in thought as much as in deed, and the weight of guilt could be crushing. The preacher's voice thundered warnings of hellfire from the pulpit, painting vivid pictures of eternal torment for those who strayed. The people believed in the presence of the devil, in witches who whispered with him, in the dangers of pride, envy, and lust. Every cough might be seen as punishment for wrongdoing, every misfortune as a sign of divine displeasure. The world was understood through the lens of sin and salvation, with each step of life measured against the possibility of eternal damnation or everlasting peace. The Reformation brought new anxieties, as the authority of the Church fractured and shifted. Under Henry VIII, monasteries dissolved, saints' shrines were destroyed, and familiar practices were upended. What had once been certain was suddenly uncertain. Should prayers be offered in Latin or in the newly translated English? Was salvation found in faith alone or in good works? To hold the wrong belief was no mere mistake. It was heresy, punishable by death. Fires burned in town squares, where heretics were tied to stakes. Their cries a reminder to all that belief itself had become a dangerous and shifting ground. The fear of sin was no longer only spiritual. It was deeply political, shaping the lives and fates of commoners and nobles alike. Despite these terrors, religion also brought profound beauty into daily life. Parish churches, though simple compared to grand cathedrals, were filled with carved wood, painted glass, and the glow of candles. Music drifted from choirs, voices rising in harmony, lifting weary hearts heavenward. Festivals tied to the church calendar, Christmas, Easter, Corpus Christi, brought joy and wonder, with processions, pageants, and feasts that seemed to transform ordinary towns into stages for the sacred. For many Tudors, these moments of shared ritual and splendor reminded them that their struggles were part of a larger, divine story, one that stretched beyond their lifetimes. Still, the fear of sin crept into the smallest corners of life. To gossip too freely, to neglect Sunday worship, to steal even the smallest coin, all could weigh heavily on the conscience. Confession and repentance offered relief, yet the certainty of forgiveness was never absolute. Superstitions blurred with religion, and charms or prayers might be carried in a pocket, hung above a doorway, or whispered before sleep to ward off evil. The sense that unseen forces hovered around every Tudor was constant, pressing them toward humility and obedience, reminding them that life was fragile and judgment inevitable. For the wealthy, faith was displayed in lavish chapels, donations to the poor, and sponsorship of church art, all signs of devotion and power. For the poor, faith was carried in worn rosaries, in whispered prayers, in kneeling upon cold stone floors. Yet both rich and poor alike were bound by the same fears, the same rituals, and the same eternal question: was one's soul secure? To walk through Tudor England was to walk beneath the gaze of God and the looming shadow of sin. Each step measured not only in earthly consequence, but in eternal weight. In the quiet hours of night, when the day's noise had faded, the fear of sin could be strongest. Alone in bed, with only the flicker of candlelight and the groan of timbers for company, thoughts turned inward. Had one prayed enough? Had one sinned too much? Would God's mercy be granted or withheld? These were the questions that filled the Tudor mind as sleep crept in. Faith was both a comfort and a burden, a rhythm that guided every hour, and a weight that pressed upon every heart. To live in Tudor England was to live always in the shadow of the sacred, where salvation and sin stood side by side, shaping each breath and binding each soul to its destiny. Life in Tudor England was lived under a constant shadow, the shadow of illness. At any moment, disease could strike, and with little knowledge of medicine, survival was never assured. The streets where people gathered were filled with filth, and the water they drank was often contaminated. Waste ran down open drains, attracting swarms of flies. Rats scurried through alleyways and storerooms, carrying with them the fleas that spread plague. To walk through a Tudor town was to move through a living web of invisible dangers. Illness was not an occasional visitor, but a frequent and familiar companion, touching every household at one time or another. The most dreaded of these diseases was the plague, which returned in waves across the centuries. Its symptoms appeared suddenly: fever, swollen buboes, blackened skin. Within days, it could sweep through entire neighborhoods, leaving behind silence where once there had been life. People feared the very air, believing in miasma, the idea that foul smells carried sickness. Fires were lit in the streets to cleanse the air, and herbs were hung in doorways to ward off the invisible threat. But fear could do little to halt its course. Whole families were carried away, and the tolling of church bells for the dead became a sound as common as the market's cry. Beyond plague, countless other illnesses plagued the Tudor body. Smallpox scarred the skin, fevers burned the weak, and agues left limbs trembling with chill. Childbirth was perilous for women, with many lost in the act of giving life. Even the simplest wound could fester, leading to infection that no prayer or poultice could heal. Medicine was a blend of knowledge and superstition, with remedies drawn from herbs, charms, and the ancient writings of Galen. Physicians spoke of balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and prescribed bleeding or purging to restore harmony. To the Tudor ear, it sounded wise. To the Tudor body, it was often cruel. The poor had little access to physicians and relied instead on folk remedies passed from generation to generation. A sprig of rosemary for memory, garlic to ward off sickness, honey to soothe wounds. Each plant carried both cure and comfort. Cunning folk and wise women offered charms alongside their brews, blurring the line between healing and magic. Sometimes the remedies worked, sometimes they did not, but in a world where hope was scarce, even a whispered spell could bring solace. The body was fragile, yet the will to endure was strong, and people clung to any thread that might keep illness at bay. Cleanliness, as we know it today, was not part of Tudor life. Baths were rare, and washing was often limited to the hands and face. Clothes were worn until they grew ragged, then patched and worn again. Lice and fleas were constant companions, scratched at in silence. The air indoors was thick with smoke from hearth fires, which stung the lungs and clung to hair and cloth. In the countryside, animals shared close quarters with people, their smells mingling with human life. This was not a world scrubbed and polished, but one where dirt was accepted as part of existence, woven into every corner of daily living. Hospitals existed, but they were few and far between, and their care was more spiritual than medical. To be admitted was to be placed under prayer and charity, with food and shelter offered as comfort. Healing, when it came, was seen as a gift from God rather than the skill of man. The wealthy sometimes sought alchemists, hoping for secret cures hidden in strange mixtures of metals and herbs. Others turned to astrology, believing the alignment of stars guided the state of the body. Yet no matter the method, the truth remained. Life was fragile, and death was never far. For the Tudor child, survival was uncertain. Many did not live beyond their first years, lost to fever, infection, or hunger. Families grew accustomed to grief, burying infants before they could walk, before they could speak. The churchyards filled with small graves, each one a reminder of the fragility of existence. Those who survived childhood carried scars, whether on their skin, in their lungs, or in the memories of loss. To live at all was to live against the odds, and each passing year was both a burden and a gift. As night fell and candles guttered low, fear of sickness lingered in the silence. A cough in the dark, a sudden chill, a rash upon the skin, all could signal the beginning of an end. Families whispered prayers, hung herbs above their doors, and placed their trust in God's mercy. Health was never guaranteed, only borrowed from one day to the next. In Tudor England, the body was a vessel easily broken, and each heartbeat was a fragile reminder of life's uncertain hold. Disease and dirt were inescapable companions, and to survive them was less a certainty than a miracle. Though Tudor life was harsh, marked by hunger, labor, and illness, it was not without moments of joy. Leisure and festivity offered precious escapes from hardship, brief windows where music, laughter, and color replaced the grinding weight of daily struggle. Across villages and towns, people looked forward to holy days and fairs, days when fields lay untended and work was set aside. On such occasions, the air filled with merriment, the smell of roasted meats, and the sound of fiddles or flutes carried on the wind. For a Tudor soul weary from toil, these gatherings were like the sun breaking through a long stretch of cloud. Music was at the heart of Tudor leisure. From the noble courts, where lutes, viols, and recorders wove intricate harmonies, to the humble cottage where a single drum or pipe kept time, music stitched itself into the fabric of life. Dancing, too, was beloved. Country dances brought neighbors together in lively circles, steps stamping against wooden floors or open fields. Courtly dances, elegant and measured, displayed grace and refinement among the wealthy. Even in the smallest village, the sound of a tune could draw a crowd, with laughter and clapping echoing into the night. Music and dance were universal languages, binding rich and poor alike. The calendar itself was punctuated by festivals that blended the sacred and the secular. May Day brought greenery and ribbons, with maypoles raised high and garlands worn in hair. Young and old alike joined in games, singing and feasting beneath the spring sky. At harvest, the people gathered to give thanks, celebrating the hard-won fruits of the earth before the long winter ahead. Christmas, too, was marked with feasts, carols, and plays, even in the simplest homes. Each festival broke the monotony of survival, offering a reminder that life could still hold moments of wonder. The theater also flourished in Tudor times, particularly in the reign of Elizabeth I. In London, purpose-built playhouses like the Theatre and later the Globe drew crowds eager for stories of love, betrayal, comedy, and tragedy. For a penny, one could stand among the groundlings, carried away by the power of words and performance. Traveling players brought theater to smaller towns, setting up in market squares or in yards, transforming ordinary spaces into stages. These performances, filled with energy and imagination, allowed audiences to step outside their daily struggles and into worlds of kings, fools, and heroes. Sporting games, too, brought escape. Archery, once a required practice for men, became a form of recreation, with competitions held on village greens. Football, rough and unregulated, was played with gusto, often spilling into chaos. The wealthy hunted deer or hawked with falcons, displaying their status as much as their skill. Cards and dice provided quieter diversions, though they carried the temptations of gambling. Even the simplest game of nine men's Morris, scratched into a board or tabletop, offered a respite from labor. These moments of play, whether grand or humble, reminded Tudors that joy could be found in competition and camaraderie. Alehouses were another center of leisure, where townsfolk gathered after long days of work. Here, mugs of ale loosened tongues, and conversations flowed as freely as the drink. Stories were shared, songs were sung, and bonds of friendship or rivalry were formed. For many, the alehouse was a second hearth, a place where the burdens of the day could be set aside, at least for a while. Yet even in this merriment, there lingered the risk of quarrels or disorder, for drink could stir anger as easily as joy. Still, the alehouse was an essential thread in the fabric of Tudor leisure. Festivities were not without their shadows. The authorities often frowned on excessive revelry, fearing that drunkenness, gambling, or idle play might lead to sin or unrest. Laws attempted to regulate which sports were permitted, which games could be played, and even how long people might spend in leisure. But human hearts craved escape, and despite restrictions, the rhythms of music, the call of games, and the joy of festivals endured. For those whose lives were weighed down by hunger, disease, or endless toil, these moments were lifelines, brief yet vital glimpses of freedom. In the end, leisure in Tudor England was not just about play. It was about survival of the spirit. Where work wore down the body and fear pressed upon the mind, festivals, music, and companionship lifted people beyond the weight of their struggles. Whether standing in a crowded market to hear a tune, joining hands in a circle dance, or laughing over dice by the fire, these moments gave meaning to lives otherwise bound by hardship. They were fragile, fleeting, yet unforgettable, like sparks of light against a darkened sky. In Tudor England, leisure was not luxury, it was hope itself. As the sun dipped below the horizon in Tudor England, the world transformed. Daylight, though harsh and filled with toil, gave way to a darkness that carried its own set of fears and mysteries. With no gas lamps or electricity to push back the night, households relied on flickering candles or smoky rushlights to light their way. Shadows stretched across timbered walls, and every creak of what seemed louder in the silence. The streets, once alive with voices and clatter, grew quiet, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant tolling of a church bell. To live through nightfall was to accept vulnerability, to surrender to forces unseen. For the ordinary Tudor, bedtime was often dictated by the sun itself. Work and leisure ended when the light faded, and most people retired early, their bodies exhausted from labor. Beds ranged from straw-filled pallets for the poor to carved wooden frames with feather mattresses for the wealthy. Families often slept close together, sharing warmth beneath heavy woolen blankets. In cottages, animals might be tucked in nearby, their presence part of the household's rhythm. Sleep was rarely deep or uninterrupted. Many rose in the middle of the night for prayers, to tend fires, or simply to sit wakeful in the quiet hours. The streets after dusk were not safe places. Without the bustle of day, shadows concealed danger. Thieves and drunkards roamed, and without adequate watch, crime often went unchecked. The night was also the realm of superstition. Spirits and ghosts were believed to wander in the dark, and witches were said to conduct their secret rites under the moon. People moved quickly if they had to walk after sundown, clutching lanterns close, whispering prayers for protection. To step into the Tudor night was to step into uncertainty, where every sound might signal threat, every shadow might hold more than it seemed. Inside the home, light came from candles and hearths, their glow soft but limited. A candle was precious, not wasted on idle hours, so most activity slowed. Families gathered near the fire, telling stories, mending clothes, or simply sitting in silence. The fire itself offered both comfort and necessity, for without it, the chill crept quickly into bones. Its crackle and warmth became a gentle lullaby, lulling the weary toward rest. But even within the home, night carried risks. Chimneys might smoke, sparks could set thatch ablaze, and the smallest flame could turn destructive. Vigilance was constant, even in the search for peace. The wealthy experienced night differently, retreating into grander chambers hung with tapestries to block the cold. Servants might carry torches through dim hallways, lighting the way to bedchambers. Curtains were drawn around beds to preserve warmth and privacy, and prayers were murmured before sleep. Yet even here, amidst velvet and carved wood, fear lingered. Superstitions touched noble and peasant alike, and the night's silence reminded all that sickness, fire, or death might come unbidden. No rank or wealth could fully shield a Tudor household from the shadows of darkness. Dreams were seen as windows into the soul, carrying messages or warnings. A peaceful dream could be taken as a sign of divine favor, while nightmares were viewed with suspicion as whispers of sin or devilish influence. People prayed to ward off troubling visions, hoping for rest unbroken by fear. Sleep was not merely rest, it was another frontier, one that brought its own uncertainties. To close one's eyes in Tudor England was to surrender, trusting that the morning would come, that life would carry forward for another day. The watchmen who patrolled the streets called out the passing hours, their voices breaking through the silence. Their cries of all's well reassured those tucked into their homes, yet also reminded them of the dangers that lurked in the unseen. For some, night was an opportunity to conspire, to steal, or to slip unnoticed through shadowed lanes. For others, it was simply a time of rest, when exhaustion overcame fear and the body sank into sleep despite all risks. The night was a veil, hiding both safety and peril, depending on where one stood. As the long hours stretched on, Tudor England slumbered uneasily beneath the stars. Darkness was not merely an absence of light, but a presence of its own, filled with fears, hopes, and the fragile trust that dawn would return. In cottages and manor houses alike, candles guttered, fires dimmed, and breathing slowed into sleep. The land grew quiet, save for the whisper of wind or the cry of some distant creature. Nightfall in Tudor England was a time of surrender, when the world pulled inward, cloaked in shadow, waiting for the light of morning to break once more. And so the day ended, as it always did, with rest fragile, yet necessary, for the struggles and labors that awaited with the rising sun. And so, Our walk through Tudor England draws to its quiet end. We have risen with the dawn in a timbered home, sat at the humble table where hunger was never far, felt the weight of endless labor, and wandered the crowded streets and markets. We have entered chapels heavy with incense and fear, faced the frailty of health in a world of dirt and disease, joined in laughter and song at feasts, and finally, we have stood in the shadows of night, where silence wrapped the land in both fear and peace. The Tudors lived lives both fragile and resilient, carried forward by faith, toil, and the rhythm of days not so unlike our own. Their world was marked by hardship, but also by moments of warmth, of song, of shared humanity. As you rest now, perhaps you carry with you a sense of their world, distant yet strangely close, echoing softly through time. Let the images of flickering candles, quiet hearths, and hushed streets settle gently in your mind. Let the past fade into dream as you surrender to your own night's rest. May sleep come easily, carrying you with it, as surely as dawn once came to the Tudors and will come again for you in the morning light.